My name is Dr. Remster. I'm a professor in the Sociology and Criminology department here. And when I'm not teaching, I study mass incarceration, how it affects everything from the individuals who are incarcerated to their families, to their communities, to our entire society. And today we're going to be focusing in on racial inequality, which honestly you really can't miss it and talk about mass incarceration. It's pivotal to it. And I'm fairly certain that if Dr. King were alive today, he would be rolling over in his grave, right? Because in the height of his time, he was calling for criminal justice reform. And instead, we've done the exact opposite that he advocated. Instead, we went and expanded our prison system to unprecedented size around the world, right? So I'm going to give you just an idea of the size. Sorry if you're well-versed in that, but just a little review. And then I'm going to highlight how specifically our system of mass incarceration makes racial inequality worse. And then we're going to end on a positive note talking about what we can actually do to change this, because it is very much a policy choice that we have a system like this, and it doesn't have to be this way. There are many alternatives. Okay, so when I say that we have a big system, you need to understand that it has not always been that way, right? Instead, we went through this dramatic period of expansion, starting in the mid to late 1970s, right? And then we peaked in the late 2000s, and right now we're like, people are getting really excited about that tiny little decline you see in the end, right? Like literally cheering, saying mass incarceration is over. No. We'll get to that, but we're basically plateauing or decreasing a tiny, tiny little bit every year in the last 2 or 3 years, right? But this is a new phenomenon, having a system this big, right? And as I already mentioned, we have the biggest system in the entire world, right? Above and beyond any other country, our system is uniquely American. Nobody else, not a developing country, not a country with, where there are no civil rights or freedoms or protections, has a system as big as ours, right? And it's not because we have a higher crime rate. So we're known as this incredibly massive, massive system. And importantly, as I just mentioned, this is not due to crime, right? You can see over time in the figure right now that for a while, crime was going up, right? But starting in the 1990s, we had a historic drop in crime, and it's continuing to drop, right? And right where the yellow and the blue diverge, we just kept on expanding our prison system, right? Which is how we know that it's a policy choice. It's not due to locking up a bunch of people who are committing crimes. Okay, so how many people are we talking about here? Right? We say we lock up a lot of people. Incarceration has become so common, we now call it a social institution in society. Sociologists do. Right alongside the labor market, education, church, that's how common it is, right? 1 in 100 adults right now, or 2.3 million people across the country, is in a state, federal, or county jail. Right, is physically behind bars. And so how many people is that really? Think about, we can compare it to college, right? Another major institution that is obviously the opposite of prison, it's where you get a positive credential that hopefully sets you on a pathway to success. The number of people locked up right now is actually equivalent to, if we take all the students at Villanova, all the students in the Big East Conference, the SEC, the ACC, the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the Big 12, and let's throw in the Ivies. That's how many people we're talking about are in prison right now, right? And because we're talking here to talk about race today, this is probably the most striking fact of all. There are more black men physically in prison right now than there are in college, right? In 2016, more black men in prison than college. That's a problem, right? And because most people who go into prison come back out, right? 95% of all people do. We don't use the death penalty very much anymore, and very few people die in prison, right? So everybody who's going in is coming back out. We've got millions and millions more people living in the population in our communities as our neighbors and our friends and family and employees that have been incarcerated at some point in their lifetime. Right? So sociologists had to come up with a term to categorize or to refer to this group of people who had this very unique set of obstacles and experiences. Right? So we call this the felon class. Right? There are currently 16 million people in the United States who have been convicted of a felony at some point. Right? So much, much larger than just the number of people that are currently locked up. And when you divide that out, that 16 million people is about 7.5% of the adult population. Right? When you look by race, it's over 1 in 5 African Americans, right, has been convicted of a felony. And when you add sex into that equation, you get 1 in 3. Right? Is huge, right? A very common life experience. So we've got 16 million people, American citizens, have been convicted of a felony, and we've got 700,000 people coming out each year. That's a lot of people who are looking for jobs and housing and trying to reestablish their relationships. 700,000 people is a lot more than, first of all, the number of immigrants that we have coming to the United States right now. It's more than the population of a handful of small states put together. It's actually more than all of the fast food jobs available each year, right? So there simply are not enough. Reintegration is very difficult when you have this many people, returning citizens coming in and out, trying to rebuild their lives, right? Okay. So there's a lot of people who are incarcerated or who have been incarcerated, but it actually extends way beyond that because most people have kids, right? People who've been incarcerated are no different. Half of all state and federal inmates right now have a kid. That's a lot of kids who are dealing with having their parent locked up right now, right? When you break it out by race, it's a shocking 1 in 4 black kids born in 1990, right? That's most of your cohort. People that were born within a couple of years of you grew up having experienced, most likely their dad, incarcerated by the age of 14. 1 in 4, right? And when you compare that to 3.6% of similar circumstances of white kids, right? Super stark racial divides. In fact, parental incarceration has become so common, I put up here, Sesame Street had to make an episode to talk to kids about parental incarceration because social workers and parents and teachers, this was like this huge elephant in the room. What do you tell your kid? How do you talk to them? This is a really challenging obstacle for a little kid to understand, right? So it's become so common in our American society right now. We now have a Sesame Street episode about it that you can watch on YouTube, right? Okay. So incarceration makes inequality worse, right? Generally, we're always trying to reduce inequality. Incarceration makes it worse in 2 ways, right? First of all, the people who go to prison are already incredibly disadvantaged, right? They're primarily low income, low education, low skill. Things are not going so great for them, right? Those are the people that disproportionately go to prison. But the second way, the big way that I'm interested in a lot, is that going to prison has this, piles on this whole set of additional bad things, right? It affects every life domain. No matter how good or bad things were for you before you went, prison makes things empirically tested, right? Quantitatively worse for you. We know. And so I'm going to quickly go through these domains and talk about how we see the big racial gaps growing here. Right? Okay, so civic costs. We are the only nation in the world, in addition to having the highest incarceration rate, that bans ex-offenders, people who are no longer incarcerated, from voting. Right? That has a big impact on a democracy. Right? In fact, because black males are more likely to go to prison. There are actually technically more black males disenfranchised now than in 1870, which was the height of Jim Crow, right? When we were fighting for equal rights to vote. What that means, because of contemporary rates of or levels of segregation, is that you have whole communities of people of color with no political voices. Right? In West Philly or North Philly around here, this matters a lot, right? And it actually doesn't just matter for the people who have been incarcerated or their communities where they come from. Sociologists have actually estimated that it has affected national elections, right? Accounting for things like voter turnout, how people are likely to vote. We're pretty good at predicting all that stuff. When we take it all together, we can look back and see, well, how many people are disenfranchised in this year? We know that Al Gore would have been president. We're pretty confident in this, instead of the first Bush, if felons had been able to vote. Right? That means we could have had a different path for our country. That means it affects every single one of you, even though you were most likely babies when that happened, right? But going back, JFK might also not have won. Right? So huge, huge changes because we chose to take away the rights of people who are no longer incarcerated. Right? It's a state-by-state issue. Some are more lenient or give back privileges better than others. But a lot of states continue to take away your right to vote for life, right? Okay. So this also affects state representation. Right? So some of my research with Dr. Rory Kramer here at Villanova has looked at how the way we count prisoners for political representation is very problematic, because when we started counting people, right, so this is a census, how do we apportion representation? Remember back to civics class or political science, you're supposed to be 1 person equals 1 vote, right? Foundation of our democracy. Well, we count people in the places that they're incarcerated, right? So this wasn't a big deal when the founding fathers made that rule a couple hundred years ago, because there were so few people incarcerated. But we never adjusted our system to account for this, right? So because prisons are, think about Pennsylvania, mostly located in rural areas, and prisoners are mostly drawn from urban minority areas, we have millions of people counted in the wrong place for political representation. Right? What that means is it gives a lot of power to predominantly white rural areas and takes away a lot of political voting power from urban areas. Right? So Rory Kramer and I wanted to calculate out what this actually does to Pennsylvania. And so we removed all the prisoners from their correctional facilities, right? Their little communities where they're not members of those communities, right? They're not part of the services or anything that has to do with that community. They're just physically incarcerated. Their prison is located in that community, right? And when we removed them, we found out that 7 districts in Pennsylvania are violating the 1 person, 1 vote Supreme Court rule, right? They're violent, they're not legally, they don't qualify to be districts because they're using prisoners to stack their deck, right? They're phantom constituents. They have no power, they have no voice, yet they're counted as population counts to get, to qualify as a district, right? And then interestingly, when we put the people back where they came from, which is primarily in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, the districts are way too big, right? Which means they're dramatically underrepresented, right? So we've got 3 districts in Philadelphia that need to be broken apart, right, into a whole nother district. In fact, that are large enough because 2 out of 3 of these are a majority minority district, right? Which means that it's predominantly made up of people of color, right? And the Voting Rights Act guarantees, hopefully, ideally, that when there's a sizable amount of racial minorities, we should get a district for them, right? If Philly got a whole other majority minority district, which is what Dr. Kramer's and my research finds, things would change dramatically, right, in terms of political power. That would be huge. So we're not representing people accurately because of where prisoners are counted, and this has huge implications for race, right? Because when you put everybody back where they should be counted, because importantly, remember, you're only in prison for a couple of years. You live in your community most of the time, right? The census is, unfortunately, it's only taken every 10 years. The bulk of those 10 years, you were living in your community in West Philly, right? But you were counted on the day that you were incarcerated, and you happened to be in rural central Pennsylvania, right? So what happens is that the average white voter, when we put everybody back in the places that they should, where they live and sleep most of the time, would lose a bunch of people from their district, right? And the average black voter would gain a dramatic amount, right? Over 700 new people, right, who are counted elsewhere would be returned to their districts. That's what's driving those numbers of there are 3 districts that are too big, right? Similarly for Latinos. Latinos would see an average of 400 new people in their district, right? Showcasing how underrepresented minorities are right here in Pennsylvania, right? And this is a huge barrier to change, right? Because if you don't get to partake in politics and have your voices heard, how are things going to change, right? That's why people who have voices, it's so important, right? We're going to get to that. Why we know and we speak up about this, right? Because the voices have been effectively silenced from the communities that are most impacted. Okay, so job market, right? Once you've been convicted of a felony, you have to check that box. If you've ever filled out an application for a landlord lease or a job, you have to check that box no matter how long ago you were convicted, right? You have to check that box the rest of your life. So that affects employment, right? It's an easy way for employers. It's legal discrimination. It doesn't matter. They can take that into account. It doesn't qualify like race, sex, or age does, or gender or disabilities. So they can legally discriminate on that, and when they have lots of applications and they know nothing else about you other than that you had to check that box, it's an easy way to weed out. Importantly, it's even worse. This probably isn't surprising, but it's not just for people, it's not just bad or difficult for people who've been convicted of a crime. It's way, way worse for people who are African American and convicted of a crime, right? It's kind of double stigma. We know there's racial discrimination in the job market. Well, there's also criminal justice contact discrimination. And so people of color are especially disadvantaged with the criminal record in finding employment, which is key to reintegrating to surviving, right? You gotta get a job. Otherwise, you're gonna turn back to crime, right? It's not surprising that 2 out of 3 of those 700,000 people being released and back into communities every single year will go back within 3 years, will have a new offense. We'll have a new offense within 3 years, right? 2 out of 3. If you can't get a job, how could you possibly make it, right? And we know it's pretty hard to get a job. The other area that is impacted are just our basic employment statistics, right? So the Bureau of Labor Statistics is a very important indicator of society. What's our unemployment rate? How racially unequal is it? Right? Is something we're always very interested in. Well, because we put 2.3 million people in prison, predominantly African Americans, we forgot to count those people in the statistics, right? Because it wasn't always this way. We expanded the system. We didn't change how we were calculating our unemployment statistics. And even though they're sitting idle, unemployed, they weren't included in the numerator or the denominator, right, to calculate the unemployment. So in the early 90s, all of a sudden, everybody's thinking that America is doing great. Unemployment has dropped. In fact, it's starting to equalize between blacks and whites. Look how much progress we've made. This is fantastic. Those reports were completely wrong because we had over 1 million black men sitting in prison that weren't eligible to work, right? And once we included those people back in because they're technically unemployed, we weren't doing nearly as well as we thought we were, right? So it really distorted progress. It gave a false sense that we were doing better than we were. Okay, then we get health costs, right? So not surprisingly, going to prison, when you live in, so this is a very overcrowded prison in Pennsylvania. They've literally turned a gym into like triple bunks to house people, is not good for your health, right? Is that surprising? But it especially increases physical health limitations. Right? And this is a big deal because that's the job that people who are incarcerated are most likely to be able to perform when they get out of prison, is manual labor. Right? But when you can't lift things anymore, you're not qualified. Right? So we know that above and beyond any health problems you had before you went to prison, you have substantially more when you're released, right, in terms of physical health. We also see higher rates of stress-related illnesses, so things like stroke, heart attack. It's very stressful living in these kinds of conditions where people are literally out to get you, right? It's a fight or flight response situation. It takes a toll on your health over time. Right? People who are, you wouldn't expect to see the kinds of, basically prison speeds up the aging process, right? So you've got people in their 40s experiencing health issues that on the outside you wouldn't expect someone to experience until they're in their 60s, right? So it's not good. And the other area that's especially important for its racial implications is that living in these very tight quarters, disease spreads rapidly, right? So things like tuberculosis, nobody even remembers this, but it used to be a big deal 100 years ago. And then we thought we eradicated it. And now we're seeing spikes in prisons, right? And what happens is people in prisons they're in there, they're living in really close quarters, things aren't quite always sanitary. There's lots of things going on where you might pick up that disease. Then you go back out to your family, and then they're more likely to have that disease. So sexually transmitted diseases, HIV, any type of infectious disease, we're seeing an influx, especially in African American communities because of incarceration, right? Okay. So lastly, not surprisingly, incarceration is not good for relationships, right? It's very destructive. People who go to prison are more likely to get divorced. This has major implications for Black families, right? Because it's destabilized them dramatically. It's directly linked to a rise in female-headed households, right, which is equated with more poverty, right? So incarceration on the whole has destabilized Black communities, made things harder for Black families, increased poverty among them. And it's not just for the people who are physically incarcerated or the person that they're married to. It's intergenerational now, right? And what that means is it's not just bad that 1 in 4 Black kids born in 1990 had their dad incarcerated by the time they were 14. That kid's gonna experience real effects for the rest of his life, right? On average. That child is more likely to be incarcerated himself when he grows up. The child is more likely to grow up in poverty, more likely to drop out of school and have lower educational attainment, right? And more likely to have emotional and behavioral problems. Okay, not surprisingly, we think about when dad is removed from the home, this is a traumatic experience, right? So what this means is that even if we ended mass incarceration today, we would be experiencing the ripple effects for generations to come, right? Because there are little kids out there right now who are experiencing this, who are going to grow up and have their own kids, and it just keeps passing on and on, right? So the intergenerational aspect is particularly important, right, in thinking about what this system means. Right? And when we take all this stuff together, right, we basically have male role models completely absent in communities, right? So those kids, even with the best of support systems and even that they have some resources and things like that, they don't have anyone to look up to, right, to teach them basic stuff, right? It's really destabilizing for communities when you have, because incarceration is just incredibly concentrated. It's not randomly distributed throughout the United States, right? Instead, it's where crime is concentrated, where low income and poverty and all sorts of high-risk disadvantage factors, right, are all bundled together. Okay, so I remind you, before mass incarceration happened, Dr. King was like, hey, criminal justice, the problems with this system is a huge problem for racial inequality. We have to fix this, right? And the way he wanted to fix it was to overhaul criminal justice policies. That's important because there's current disagreement going on right now about whether we just need to fix the whole system of our country that's messed up, right? Where if we would fix poverty and jobs and opportunity, then criminal justice would just sort of fix itself like as an afterthought, like it will ripple through and take care of it. I agree with Dr. King, as do a lot of criminologists and sociologists, in saying, you know what, we've always had inequality, unfortunately, in the United States. And while we would love to reduce it, or maybe get rid of it all the way, it's pretty unlikely, right? But we can fix the criminal justice policies that mistreat and make things so much worse for African Americans, right? So, I mentioned in the beginning, there's been some recent optimism that we know mass incarceration is bad, right? Starting maybe a year ago, I had students coming into my class and saying, and I'm like, mass incarceration is a big deal, and they're like, everybody knows that, even my dad knows it. Like, we're fixing it. Like, it's gonna happen, it's gonna end in my lifetime, I'm really not that worried about it anymore, right? It's true that it is very much a part of national conversations. You can't turn on the television or go on social media or watch a presidential debate without hearing people talk about some of these issues. That's tremendous progress. But nobody is actually doing anything to put an effective dent in the system that we have, right? All the little reforms, it's awesome to see that they're bipartisan. We have people across the political spectrum coming together and saying, hey, this is not good, what can we do about it? They're tiny, tiny incremental reforms, right? We're not even talking about like cutting the incarceration rate in half. It's just a little drop in the bucket of things that have been very hard to get through Congress, things that President Obama has gotten huge pushback for are minimal, right? And part of the reason that people are willing to have these conversations about change is because we financially cannot afford to continue this system. That's the worst argument I've ever heard, because that means when things get better in 20 years, right, eventually the economy will fully recover, just like it's on its upward trajectory now, we'll just go back to mass incarceration, right? We'll just say, oh, well, we can afford it now. Making a financial argument is not the best way to convince people, right? Not enough to make meaningful change. It's not enough to change anything big about the system, right? Because politics is at the heart of our criminal justice system, for better or for worse, right? So we need to change people's minds or have policies that are criminal justice reform policy based, like Dr. King said. And importantly, we probably need to incentivize these reforms, because all the action with mass incarceration happens at the state level, right? There are very few people in federal prisons. By far, most people are in state prisons because they violated state law, right? So President Obama or the Attorney General, whoever important in the federal government, can stand up and say, hey, everybody, this is bad, let's do some stuff, here's some suggestions, here's some evidence-driven policies. Why would states follow, right? These are elected officials, and unfortunately Americans have a very false, inaccurate perception of how safe or unsafe they are, right? And politicians thrive on, they need to get elected, and it's very easy to get elected by saying you are going to keep communities safe, right? You're going to protect your voters. Everybody wants to be safe. That is a fundamental concept, right? But it's not fair to say that we're not safe anymore. Crime is continuing to go down. We live in a safer society than we ever have lived in, right? Okay, so we probably need federal incentives, right? Maybe somebody is going to get additional school funds if you enact one of these reforms that I'm going to talk about. Is probably, unfortunately, necessary in order to institute meaningful change, right? Okay, so if I had to pick my top 8, these are them. In actual changes that is based on evidence, right? Research, data-driven evidence for policies that I feel comfortable saying we could safely do, right? That we're not going to feel any type of impact in our safety. It's going to actually save us money and make society better because all these people come back to our communities, right? Do you want to live next door to someone that is having all these incredible hardships and disadvantages? No, right? So a big thing that we could do is divert people before they ever get to prison, right? That's stopping people at the front end and saying, hey, if you're going to be convicted of a drug offense, we don't offer rehabilitation and treatment in prison anymore, by the way, right? So someone that's convicted of a drug offense is not going to get help for their addiction, right? They're just going to serve some time and then be dumped back on the street and unfortunately probably be rearrested because we never addressed their problem. If we got people into treatment programs, treatment that works, right? We could effectively reduce the number of people going to prison. We could also reduce the number of drug issues overall, right? Would be a really good way to divert people from ever getting into the system, right? And lots of other countries treat drug use as a public health problem and not as a criminal justice problem. Another biggie is the sentence length. We are sentencing people for far too long to prison across violent and non-violent offenses, right? So sometimes people are like, oh yeah, I know that because of the war on drugs was really harsh, we were over-sentencing people for minor drug stuff and I'm okay with reducing that. I think people can get their heads around that. That's fine. Violent crimes are actually driving the sentence length problem, right? We have the longest sentence lengths in the world. We're too harsh. It doesn't get us anything. It doesn't deter people. It certainly doesn't rehabilitate them, and it costs us a lot of money. And especially things like health. The longer you're behind bars, the worse the health problems get, right? And eventually you're going to come back to society. But you can see from these examples how much longer, right? We're here at a Catholic institution. I think it's important to think about issues like forgiveness, right? How long is enough? I mean, I can tell you the statistical formula for when someone is unlikely to reoffend. We've worked that out. But as Americans, we seem to be very angry at people on the whole, right? When can we start to move past that and look at other advanced countries that have similar characteristics to us across the board and say, we've got people locked up for too long, way, way too long, right? So we have to seriously think about that. And that's a tough issue, but we can institute meaningful change without it. All right, third, we gotta get rid of or change some of the mandatory sentencing laws. A lot of people are incarcerated because a judge's hands were physically tied pretty much. Right? Mandatory sentencing laws take all the power away from the judge, from considering any circumstances or details of the crime that might affect how he or she would sentence you. Instead, if you have committed this crime, it's automatic that you're getting this penalty. No circumstances, background factors, current life factors taken into account. That's fueled the prison boom, right? So reducing those mandatory minimums, giving power back to judges to say, well, in this set of circumstances, this person had this thing going on and he wasn't really integral and he probably doesn't need the full penalty, right? Would save a lot, putting discretion back. Another biggie is we have a huge violent offense category. It's very problematic. Because you will hear a cynic tell you that even if we and it's true, even if we let all of the people incarcerated right now out for the drug offenses, we would still have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Right? And people are like, oh, well, we have such a high violent crime rate. Not high enough to justify that rate, right? We are locking up too many violent offenders for too long, right? And the violent offense category is full of lots of petty people, lots of petty offenses where people have been convicted of a low-level assault. They had a weapon on them during the crime. They weren't physically wielding it or pointing it at anybody, but when the cop patted them down, they had a knife in their pocket and they're charged with a weapons charge, right? So they're technically categorized as a violent offender versus you've got people in that category who've raped and killed people. Right? That's not the same. And this is where a huge divergence is happening between President Obama and criminal justice experts. President Obama stood 10 miles down the road this past summer at the NAACP convention and said, we got to reform criminal justice. I'm going to grant clemency for people. These are the things that I'm going to do, but I would never let anybody violent out of prison. I will never reform. There are bad people in prison that belong in prison, and we're only discussing nonviolent offenders. Right? Now, if you don't know anything about the violent offense category, that seems reasonable, right? Of course you'd want to protect your community and your country. Okay, this is what the president is saying. The president needs to read the research because there's way too many people in that category who aren't actual safety threats to society, right? That if we just narrowed it down to people who have brutally assaulted, taken other people's lives, personally victimized people, the violent offense category would be much, much smaller, and our incarceration rate would be much lower. And I understand that it's harder to talk about forgiveness and moving forward for someone who has technically been convicted of a violent offense, but if we want to change the system, we have to. Right? And if you think about letting one single act in your life define you, we've all done stupid things. We all have things that we regret. Right? We're holding people responsible for one act, letting it define their entire lives. Right? Is really problematic. Okay, so number 5. Another thing we need to do is reduce prosecutorial discretion. The reason why this is a big problem is because prosecutors are elected. So they have to be tough on crime. And they actually hold all the power, way more power than judges do in our contemporary system because they decide what to charge people with, right? And once they're sent to the judge to trial, and this person is charged with let's just say aggravated murder, right? But the judge thinks that it's really like probably manslaughter 2, right? He's reviewed the entire case, he's listened to the whole trial. He doesn't get to knock down the charges. The only choice he has is whether the person's going to be convicted of aggravated murder, right? And if this person has actually killed someone, my God, you'd better convict him rather than let him go, even though he's probably guilty of a lesser offense, right? But the prosecutor's driving that, and there's a huge discrepancy in sentences based on the level of charges or whatever charges the prosecutor has chosen. Right? And by being an elected official means you're susceptible to all sorts of pressures. This is not data driven, right? This person is worried about whether they're going to get to keep their job, and if they're not harsh on crime, someone's going to make a commercial about them and no one's going to vote for them, basically. Right? So we need to either get some checks and balances in there for the prosecutors, right? Because right now there aren't any. We need to make them not elected. Lots of countries have them as appointed officials, right? So that literally your bread and butter is not dependent on this. There's lots of other options, but right now we just sort of ignored that there's a massive amount of power right now in the hands of the prosecutor in terms of our criminal justice system. Right? Number 6, we've got a whole bunch of really old people in prison, right? Because of our mandatory minimums. They are so long, right? That people are incarcerated when they're 20, they're still sitting in there when they're 40, and their health has gotten so bad they're experiencing the health problems of an average 60-year-old. Right? And we have to provide them basic health care. Prior to the Affordable Care Act, prisoners are the only constitutionally required group to get basic health care. It's cruel and unusual punishment if we don't. Right? So you should Google if you're interested. The ACLU has really interesting videos. There's documentaries out there showing prison wards that literally look like nursing homes. People are on oxygen, people are hooked up to machines, they're in wheelchairs, they have the other inmates taking care of them, right? I mean, there's people getting basic chemo, there's people getting all sorts of, being treated for chronic health issues. Those people are not a threat to society. In fact, we're paying for their services, right? They'd be much better being released to their families. They're not a threat. And importantly, if you ever take my criminology class or any criminology class, you know that the age crime curve means that most people stop committing crime in their late teens. Right? So when we're incarcerating people that are 60, 70 years old, and there are thousands of them across the country, their likelihood of committing a crime if they were released is literally zero, right? Not to mention they're literally in a wheelchair. Like they couldn't if they wanted to, right? When you see these images, they're just so striking. But we've calculated, criminologists have actually estimated the exact risk of releasing someone who is 35 and convicted of a violent offense. If 10 years later, after the date that they were committed to that offense, their likelihood of committing a new offense returns to the general population rate, to people who have never committed, right? 10 years does that. But we're locking people up for a couple of decades. It's an ineffective use of money, right? It's not a good use of money. It's not good for the person that's sitting in there rotting, right? Who could be a contributing member of society. We need to take into account more evidence and in how we sentence and incarcerate people is the bottom line of all this. If you've been paying attention to recent criminal justice reforms, President Obama has been using his clemency power. Does anybody know what clemency is? Clemency is when you get out, right? The president, the executive branch of government grants you clemency and you're released. It's not a pardon though, right? It's different from a pardon. A pardon was when you're actually forgiven and your record is wiped clean. That's the rare controversial one. Obama has really underused clemency. He's worried about people judging him, about the pushback, about being unpopular about it. He's released some people, though. He could use that as a mechanism right now to correct, and also governors have it as well, to fix a lot of the people sitting in prison, right? Because that's part of the problem. What if we reform the laws right now? Well, we've already got all these people in the system. Well, that's why we need to use these back-end measures to help the people who are already there, right? Because we have fixed some of the mandatory minimums from the war on drugs. We realized that a lot of them were not meaningful. It took far too long to realize that they were not good, but we rolled them back. That's great. However, we didn't make them retroactive. So we have people sitting in prison right now for very lengthy sentences that if you committed the same crime today, you wouldn't get nearly as long as a sentence. Those people are ideal candidates for clemency. You've already served more than the sentence of what you would get if you got today. Why should it matter when you were convicted, right? We've changed the law because we knew the law was unfair. Sorry you were born 10 years earlier, right? Clemency would be a really good way to fix this. And then another way to address the back end problem is to offer people services, right? To facilitate reintegration, to help people get a job, maybe vocational training, to help people find a place to live, in order to reduce recidivism, right? Recidivism is people going back to prison, committing a new crime. Right? So these last couple are focusing on how to help people or fix the problems that we already have right now. But the first couple are all about going forward, right? And how we can change the system and live in a very different society that your children and grandchildren will be born into, that will be affected by this, right? None of these are easy, right? But I have as my final point, awareness is key. Most people don't have the opportunity to come to a place like Villanova or go to a freedom session school or just have access to this knowledge, right? If you just get your information from politicians and media, you would think we're about to blow up right now from all the violent predators coming to get us or something, right? We're not. We just need to bring the evidence and the research back into informing our policy so that we could move forward in a much more effective, just, racially equal society that MLK would have wanted, right? So just knowing, no matter what path you go in life, no matter where you go, who you become, you're a voter, you're a community member, you're an employee, just remembering this kind of stuff matters, right? Knowledge is power. You don't have to drop out of your major and become a social justice advocate. That would be awesome if you did, but I'm willing to, just that you were here is huge progress, right? That's why I teach, that's why I do what I do, because people have to know, right? Awareness is the beginning of a social movement for change. Okay, what kinds of questions or comments do we have? Thank you very, very much for sitting patiently. Well, I mowed through that. That just made perfect sense. You have no dying questions? Both. The rates of incarceration for black males do not map onto black male crime. It is over and above, right? And we know there's lots of research showing that we track black and brown boys into the criminal justice system at a very young age. And they're treated dramatically differently than little white boys the same age, from the way their teachers are literally, their attitudes toward them in elementary school, right? Kids are tracked into that system.
For the children that grow up with a parent in the criminal justice system, how much higher is their incarceration rate?
I'd have to send you the citation, but it's important that it's over and above, so things aren't going great for them, right? Because dad was probably providing some income, right? Some mentorship. It's a household, literally a financial difficulty when a parent is removed and going to prison. Even if they weren't, so you have to take into account, adjust for the fact that that kid's more likely to be in poverty, that kid is having some emotional issues. Once you adjust for all that, the incarceration the dad still matters on top. They're still more likely, to go to prison, right? So it's not just that they ended up in poverty because dad went and that's why they're more likely to go to prison. It's net of all that. Depends on the study, though, for the specific actual risk. What else? Do you think we can do any of these things? Oh, I lost them. Do you think people can? Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are. I'm trying to find a way to speed it up, right? But places like, lots of states have reached budget crises, and there are states in this country, Texas and California, one of them, that are spending more money on their correctional systems than they are on their education systems, right? Think about that. More money locking people up in concrete walls and cages. We basically treat animals better today, right? Been to the zoo lately. Versus K through 12 is required, that's state-funded education. There are millions and millions of kids growing up in Texas or California where they're not getting, their schools aren't getting the funds that they need because they've got to sustain this huge incarceration system, right? So because of that, they've started to say, hey, you know what, this is bad, we gotta decrease, we don't have enough money, we're still digging around the backyard, we can't find any more money, so let's try to decrease incarceration. It's not enough to make meaningful change, right? Because the economy goes up and it goes down. There will be another time when you can't afford it. If anyone has a better idea on how we could get states to I mean, I'm making an empirical argument. Do I think personally that we should have the dignity and the humanity and respect for human life, that we shouldn't want to treat people this way, and states should just say, wow, this was bad, we messed up, let's fix this? I wish, right? You make that argument all you want. It's just that it doesn't win, you know? It's really hard. And the argument that has won or made progress so far is finances, and I think that's a very dangerous, sticky area. All really good questions.
I know you make comments that sometimes it could start as early as elementary school for kids.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say education plays a large role in this?
It's part of the problem, right? If you're interested, the service learning program or the volunteering opportunities at Villanova are absolutely fantastic in terms of the experiences that you can have by going into schools that have really high risks of parental incarceration, high risks of poverty, high risks of those kids are going to grow up and be incarcerated. Those schools are a couple miles down the road from us and are way outside the Villanova bubble, right? So if those schools had and it's heartbreaking to go to those places and talk to those little innocent kids who have done nothing, know nothing, you know, this is their world. If they had enough textbooks for their classroom, not to mention an updated textbook, not to mention exposure to technology, or enough teachers to actually teach them instead of just trying to prevent fights, things would be much better, right? Definitely, we need to fix the schools, right? But we also, there's a problem. Why do we have literally law enforcement in schools right now? These little kids, like issues that when I was in high school, you would have gotten detention for, or maybe something really bad, suspension, are now being tracked into the criminal justice system. Why would we use crime control measures for kids? Right? Kids, I teach the juvenile delinquency course. We have this whole separate area of study for them because kids are more malleable, their brains aren't fully developed, they don't realize the consequences of what they're doing. All sorts of factors come into play. And when we start tracking kids in from such an early age, it's really bad news for them, right? Mm-hmm.
Are there similar or like proportionately statistics for Black women?
Generally, so Black females are more likely to be incarcerated than white females, but there's just a huge gender disparity in incarceration overall, right? So it would probably go Black males, white males, then Black females, then, right? There's definitely more Black women locked up than white women, and it has to do with the over-policing and the treatment and what's going on in their communities, right? That's part of the important thing of thinking about this. When in class I give a self-report survey, and most people have broken a law technically at some point in their lives, right? But they didn't get caught. That's why they're at Villanova, right? On this upward trajectory to success. And so that's why it's important in thinking about how people are treated, right? The people in the system are not there because most of them, because they are substantially worse than the people sitting in this room. No, it's how we treat people of color, it's how we police people of color, it's how we control populations that are viewed as a threat, fundamentally.